Welcome, everyone. Come on in. Come on in. As always, first, become part of the family. Join the newsletter, www.truehousestories.com. www.truehousestories.com. Become part of the family, and you'll learn about all disco, house, and beyond of all the luminaries that had graced us with their presence on our show each and every week. First, I want to thank everyone for the thousands, and when I say thousands because of this show, of shout outs to me for my birthday. And it felt phenomenal turning 29 again. I will say it was a wonderful feeling to feel that feeling at 29. So enough of the jokes anyway. I want to say welcome to True House Stories. I am Lenny Fontana, coming out of New York City. Today's a special episode. I'm a fan of this man that I'm going to be bringing up. I've read his books. He has, through his extensive research, through his studies as he was a scholar, which he will tell the story, and now as professor at a college, he has written some unprecedented, I'm going to call them novels, with tremendous plethora of information. You know, everybody knows about Last Night, a DJ Saved My Life, and all those great songs, but you know, this one is Love Saves the Day. So I just want to show the picture first, and this man's name. I'd like to welcome to the stage Mr. Tim Lawrence.
Hello. Thank you, Lenny. Very kind. It's a real pleasure to be here. To be here with one of my house music heroes.
Oh, thanks, Tim. And thank you for doing what you do, because you made something that was of myth become documented. A lot of things that were spoken about behind the scenes. And when I was growing up, coming up in the business, there was a lot of these stories that we spoke about, and others that were older than us who were there would tell us these stories. But to actually see them in one book, one place, and actually read it and then reread it just in case you didn't understand it the first time, I must, if I could take a hat off, I shall take my hat off to you and say, well done, Governor. Well done. But before we get into anything, two questions I asked. Number one, how you been dealing with COVID? And then we'll get into the story, of course. How's life been for you during this whole crazy time?
I think it's been difficult in many ways. It's been strange in many ways. In other ways, there's been some possibilities. I'm a relatively privileged person. I think that I actually lost half of my job to COVID, half of my university job, and that was a bit of a shock. And that was very unpleasant. And I didn't lose half of my actual work. I have to do just as much work, but I lost half of my income. So that's unwelcome. That hasn't been great. The parties that I'm involved in running, all our friends, and Lucky Cloud is the one that goes back the longest to 2003. That was when David Mancuso approached me and Colleen Murphy and suggested we start to do parties with him in London. Those parties obviously haven't been running, and that's been tough. Actually, you lose a part of your life. You lose, the parties, I think, for many of us operate in ways that we can't always quite define. Because, the people we're friendly with at these parties, we're not always socializing and hanging out with them outside of the parties. There's a kind of a different kind of sociality or friendship kind of can develop within them. But as we all know, these dance floors are sources of life for us, of expression, of connectivity. In these spaces, we move and we operate and we find meaning in different ways. And it's been it's been difficult to not have that sort of source of rejuvenation and inspiration and music and sound systems and dance movements. So that's been difficult. I haven't lost anyone very close to me to COVID, so I'm lucky in that way. Although I lost half my job, I haven't, it hasn't been a problem putting food on the plate. So I know with a lot of people who had a much tougher time in COVID, and so I've been relatively fortunate, but there has been some awkwardness, some difficulty. I did at the beginning of COVID, like many people, decide, okay, so what am I going to do with this time? And I was able to spend more time with my daughters, more time with my partner. This was a gift as well.
Right.
The weather in London for the first 2 or 3 months of COVID, in particular during lockdown, was incredible. It was and there were no cars on the streets. It was just like, wow. London was so beautiful. The air was so clean. The parks were glistening. It was like, that was good. I appreciated that for sure for a period. And the other thing is that I got to finally just decided, okay, now is the time to start work on another book. Since the last one came out in late 2016, I seem to have been very busy for quite a long period, kind of, engaging with the interest in that book, a few tours and just life and the things that, stuff going on around me. There seems to be kind of more and more of it. And that's all been exciting and engaging and meaningful, but it kind of spiraled to the point where I wasn't getting any book writing done, and I was like, this is this is a bit of an issue for me. I do. There's more I want to write about, so I did get going on another book. So that's kind of my COVID story.
Okay.
The wider community, of course, it's been heartbreaking to see how musicians and DJs and clubs have struggled. Economically, and in the UK in particular, the support has been late and meager, and I think we're only just coming out of it now, and we don't know, we might end up going back in it as well, and I don't know if we've quite managed to quantify what the losses are yet. I think that will slowly become apparent to us, partly as we regroup as communities and we start to have conversations again. I haven't spent that much time online during COVID. If anything, I spent less time online during COVID than beforehand. I just felt like I didn't want that buzz, really. And I know lots of people have found important meaning and connection through that. But that's also, I'm just saying this because I feel like a bit out of touch in some respects. I think if I'd been spending more time online, I wouldn't need to go to a party to find out how everyone's been doing. But we are beginning to reconnect, and that's where it feels really important, actually. I think we have got a Lucky Cloud party coming up on 3rd of October. And it's like, it's strange. We're doing the rapid flow test beforehand. Everyone's got to present the test in order to get in. We're having to change some things about how we're doing the party, starting earlier, ending earlier, so that we can have the windows open so we don't disturb the neighbours too much. There's all these little changes that are going on. But I think and it was a difficult decision to know whether we should go ahead with the party, because it's not as though everything is clear in the UK yet. There is still a threat. There are many people not vaccinated. There are some limits to the vaccinations, as we all know. So we weren't, it wasn't a straightforward decision to go ahead. And I know in New York, they're tossing and turning about when those parties should start again. But we did make the decision on balance in the end to do it. And overall, I think it seems as though people are happy that we're doing this.
Good.
So that's my COVID story.
You gave us a very clinical opinion on it. I love it. It was very clinical. I feel like my clinical correspondent at the UK, Tim Lawrence, just gave us a complete.
Oh no, I don't want to be clinical.
No, it's perfect. No, it was actually very. Also, I'm going to give Ultra to Tay. She was the same when she explained it as well. She broke it down in layman's terms. We found out in her story that years she was going to become a doctor. So it was like, yeah, see, that's a safe. I went like that. That's a safe expression. I went.
Fantastic.
And I could understand. I could understand listening when she was. I'm saying, man, you're very knowledgeable. Like not layman's. You're knowledgeable, like on a medical level. So, but thank you on that. Also, yes, we are here in the same situation, wondering if we're going to be going back to a lockdown. We don't know. We're hoping not, but All dudes tell. It will only tell when the flu season begins and how bad things start spreading. If it starts,
and when people start spending more time indoors and less time outdoors and that kind
right,
of thing.
because we've been blessed. Everybody's outside. Windows are fully open. Everybody's dancing. Everything is fabulous. But when we go back indoors, will it be another dark winter? Oh, Lord help us. Okay, so let's get to the nitty gritty. Because I know, listen, everybody, we're shutting down at 9 o'clock UK time. Regardless, he's got an appointment, so we got to get every question in.
Here we go.
Here we go. So, music finds you as a young man. Take us from that journey, how it begins for you, because I know you're an avid collector of music. We don't know much about if you studied any instruments or anything like that. I'd like to know that as how you go from that part to the bridge of coming into living in New York, and you could tell us the story. I know it's going to be very dynamic. So,
well, I don't want, I'm kind of, well, it's, let me stop umming and ahhing and just say that, I don't know if I give any special meaning to growing up as a kid listening to music. All I know is that it moved me, and that I had in some ways I had limited access to music, as did many people. I mean, now everything has changed, as we know, with the internet, but my access to music was fairly limited. I did develop an early and long passion for David Bowie. There's something about, I suppose if I were now to sort of try and understand a bit more, I haven't really thought about this, but there was something about, his artistry, the sense of passion that he conveyed in his voice. It wasn't a technical voice necessarily, but it conveyed emotion. And I felt, this was as an adolescent. As a teenager growing up, I really sort of, that was important for me. But I was also drawn, and after Bowie passed, I forget when that was, but it was a few years ago, and it was kind of, I'd lost touch with his music, but I'd also just reconnected with it because his final albums were quite interesting. But it was interesting in preparing for parties and maybe putting on music at parties, that you want to sort of pick out a track, right, from these historic legendary figures who maybe passed, who have gone, to just pay tribute to them. And it wasn't that straightforward going back through the David Bowie catalogue to find records that I felt might work on a dance floor. It's neither here nor there. I'm just saying Bowie was a big guy for me, but a big artist for me. But it did fade at one point, and I found I really loved. I was born in 1967, so by the time, my first album was probably Bowie's Scary Monsters, which had the single Ashes to Ashes on it, and that was kind of him dressed up as a clown walking along a beach having a conversation with an aging lady. It was very surreal, very artistic. And the Ashes to Ashes is a really interesting record. It's a beautiful record, and it's Bowie continuing his exploration with electronics. And there's a track on that album as well called Fashion, which is kind of a bit like mutant disco, basically. And I would rediscover mutant disco, if you like, many years later. But Bowie was a big influence on what we sometimes call the New Romantics. It was a movement that kind of developed in the UK in the early 1980s. A lot of it was around synthesizer music, which actually also became really big in New York in the early 1980s. There was bands like Visage and Ultravox and Duran Duran, and they were quite danceable, and they were using electronics. They stood behind synthesizers. They were kind of, subsequent incarnations, if you like, of, heavily influenced by Kraftwerk. And this music was just like, it really, it was just, I really became kind of passionate about this. I would dress up in the clothes. I would wear my mum's clothes, my mum's makeup, all the rest of it, going out to kind of school discos and what have you. And so those were some early points. But the thing that I think recurred for me is that I was drawn to rhythmic music. I liked disco, but to me, disco was also the music that I would hear on the radio as I was growing up as a kid. I was born in 1967, so if the peak of disco is, let's say, 1977, I was a 10-year-old then. And by the time you're 15 or by the time you're 18, you're not generally listening to the music you're into as a 10-year-old. So it wasn't like I felt like disco was kind of the heart of music for me, if you like. I'm not sure I'd even say that now, by the way. But I was drawn. I wanted rhythmic music, and I wasn't quite finding what I wanted. Interestingly, and the first time I found what I wanted was really in 1988, and I was a student in Manchester studying politics and modern history. I've got to keep my eye on the camera. I'm moving all over the place. I was studying politics and modern history. I was going to stay up for the summer in Manchester to work running a summer camp for kids. And a friend of mine who was also working on the camp said, "Oh, I hear the Hacienda is really good. We should go down there." And this was a Wednesday night. I knew nothing really about what we might call club culture. I mean, really nothing. I'd been out a few times. I was into politics. I was into student union politics. I love music, but I wasn't into a kind of going out scene really. But I went out that night on a Wednesday night of all nights to this night called Hot at Hacienda. And it was the beginning of the change of my life, because this was the summer of love in the UK. House music had taken the north of England in particular by storm. A lot gets written about how house music came to London via Ibiza, but the north was always dancing to up-tempo music from New York and Detroit and Philadelphia. And house had exploded in Manchester. And I walked into this scene and I'd never seen anything remotely like it before. I don't know what the capacity of the Hacienda was. If it was 1,000 people, there were podiums around the space. It was kind of like walking into a building site. It was kind of an ex-industrial style building. I would read subsequently that the sound system wasn't supposed to be very good, but my ears weren't tuned to go party and club sound systems at that point. I heard music at volume that was absolutely pulsating. And even before I had a chance to hear what was maybe the first mix, within 10 seconds of seeing this scene unfolding in front of me, I just threw myself into it, went up on a podium and threw my hands in the air. And that was that. It was instantaneous. There was no thought process or analysis required. I had arrived at something that I just thought was incredible. And it was, and a lot of it was about house music, and it felt very avant-garde. It felt very experimental, but it also felt very connected. It was warm music. It was pulsating music. So it was partly that, but it was also the scene of what we could call collective joy. Seeing everyone celebrate and do so in an uninhibited way. I had no idea about MDMA and ecstasy at that time. And the tabloids would go on to become full of this stuff, ecstasy orgies and nonsense like that, the Hacienda and what have you. To me, it was, I suppose I lived it vicariously. I would later go and take ecstasy and MDMA for sure. But that night I didn't have a clue about it, and it didn't really matter. It was like the energy was pulsating.
Did you know that was called house music, or you just heard the pulsating beat?
No, I didn't. I don't think I even knew it was called house music at that point. I mean, there had been a couple of, I would later go on to look into this, and there had been a couple of house hits in the UK already. Some early Chicago Move Your Body, I think, maybe, I forget what the actual tracks were. So I'm just trying to think, like Mars, Pump Up the Volume, but that may have been I don't know if that was 88 or if that was maybe a year or two later. But no, I didn't really know what was going on. I would find out relatively soon afterwards. But it was definitional. I mean, the embarrassing part of this story is that I then went back in the autumn, excited to take my friends down to the Hacienda, and decided to go down on a Friday night. This is all, it's all pre-internet, and I wasn't really following the listings and what have you. It just wasn't somehow part of my world. I went down on a Friday night, and it was an indie night. And I was just like, oh, whatever's happened to this place? I'm not so keen on it anymore. I mean, I just didn't know that you had to go on certain nights were dedicated to certain sounds and certain crowds. As I say, it's embarrassing to be, confessing to this, but I didn't know at the time. The point at which I started to know was about 2 or 3 years later, around 1990, 1991. I'd moved back to London. I'd suffered some tragedy in the big. In my second year at university, so this is the end of the second term at my first year at university, which is so early 1987. My dad passed away in the middle of a hip operation, and he wasn't supposed to die, and it was very, very shocking. I was very close to him. It hit me really hard. This was probably one of the reasons why I wasn't going out partying a whole lot when I was a young student. And then 3 years later, my mum died. She had stomach cancer, and my feeling was always she just never really recovered from my dad dying, and that kind of caused her cancer, and it's hard to really just put this, to go back there. I mean, I do think about them often, but it's kind of just thinking about that specific moment. But it left me feeling very bereft. I lost my anchor. I lost, parents who I was fortunate to have incredibly devoted and engaging, caring, loving, generous, and, culturally and intellectually alive parents who I spent a lot of time with. So I kind of felt although I had a very dear uncle and auntie who survived them and were, very caring towards me, there was, it was like the world was taken from under my feet. And I'd kind of decided to go into after I graduated, to try and get into journalism. And I was in journalism school, and a friend of mine from university who was also involved with kind of politics basically said, "Do you want to come to a rave?" So I started to kind of go to sorts of some raves in I think it was probably late 1990, early 1991. And they were extraordinary scenes. I suppose we would probably say that what we'd call techno music was being played. It was pretty stripped down. It wasn't entirely soul. It wasn't organized around soulfulness. Certainly there wasn't much jazz going on there. There were elements of dub were certainly incorporated. It was not a dissimilar scene to the one I experienced at the Hacienda. It was a scene of collective joy, and of people caring people who were strangers, looking after each other and enjoying each other's company. And I did find it meaningful, but I did find there was something unsustainable about it. The driving late at night, not necessarily knowing where you were going, the hours that were being, the sheer intensity of the scene was compelling, but I didn't somehow or other. It wasn't obviously sustainable, or it wasn't what I was. It wasn't the essence of what I wanted to kind of stay with. I hadn't quite found my home yet. Let's put it that way. And the same friend only, just a few months later said, "Oh, I want to take you to this club." It was called the Gardening Club. The night was Feel Real. It was a Friday night party. It was a collective of 4 DJs run by a guy called Chris, the rhythm doctor. And I went there, and that was it. That was in a way, that was the other night. My life kind of changed, if you like. It was a kind of basement venue. The sound was good. The ceilings were quite reasonably low. It was actually a room that was kind of divided into 4 parts, but all the 4 parts were connected. So you really felt like there was a real intimacy there. And the sound that was being played that night, or that party, was basically New York house music. And this opened me up musically in ways that rave hadn't. It was house music, as I'd heard it at the Hacienda, but there was clearly a new level of emphasis on soulfulness, elements of R&B, jazz, and dub, as well as significant influences from Latin America and Africa, were all being incorporated into this music that I felt at that moment had infinite potential. It was like the house beat was a matrix, and you could feed whatever you wanted into that matrix. And to me, mixing was like magic. The transition. I even went up to quite soon afterwards. I befriended Chris, and I thought his selections are amazing. I was working in journalism by this point. I was earning decent money, and I had some spare money, and I'd give him like £50 a week. I guess it's like $75. And I'd say, just get me whatever whatever records you're getting. And it didn't carry on for that long, because at some point I started going to the record stores myself. But that was kind of, I was feeding off this music. Was like blood to me. It was like water. It was just kind of, I felt it was essential to my system.
What?
And
while you were doing that, and I know Chris, really great.
Yeah.
Great person, great DJ.
Fantastic. Yeah.
That clip because I played there as well. What kind of journalism were you doing that you were earning good? You said,
I was in political journalism. I mean, I'm still am. I'm quite political.
So is that dealing with like parliament issues and things?
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's a really good question because I was getting into, there was TV programs that were basically weekly TV programs about a week in Westminster, a week in Parliament. I was involved in some documentaries, investigative documentaries, that were kind of analysing, government changes to the health service or the education system. I had some research skills, and I'd been sort of wondering whether I wanted to go into work in a university as a researcher and a lecturer, or whether I wanted to go into journalism. And at that point, I felt I really wanted to be a journalist, or I felt that the choice I wanted to make was journalism because it was more immediate. It seemed to have more impact. It was more up to speed. And yeah, I just thought that was kind of, that was what I wanted to do. And it's not as though I would, and I was into politics and I was into political change. And I felt that this would be meaningful. But after doing it for a few years, I became a little bit disillusioned. And I was also, I would say, a little bit depressed. And being a little bit depressed had quite a lot to do with my parents having passed away. So I got to the point where the other thing is, I suppose, and you kind of probably get a sense of this by if you kind of like hold Love Saves the Day, and it's 500 pages long. And I just felt a bit frustrated that even though I was working at the more analytical end of journalism, like the late night TV shows that would kind of be an hour-long analysis of the day's news, or, documentary series that would be 6 parts on the health service or whatever, I still wasn't finding it fulfilling. I wanted a long form, really. I didn't want short form. If you put it in DJ terms, I wanted the 12-hour set, not the 1 hour banging kind of, go in, drive the crowd wild and then head off again. I wanted to get deep into what I was doing. So I'd kind of felt like journalism wasn't quite where I wanted to be. There's a big moment was hearing a professor who's a Palestinian professor who was based at Columbia University in New York, called Edward Said, who wrote about literature and wrote about the cultural politics of literature, and was a key figure in this field that was emerging called post-colonial studies. And he had, in addition to all his kind of interesting work, had written something, had done for the BBC, had contributed what was called the Wreath lecture series, which was a series of 6 lectures, invited lectures, and he did it on what he called the public intellectual. And this can sound a bit, I don't know, I'm not trying to sort of be funny when I say these kind of things, or pompous or what have you. But the key thing I got out of this is, if you go to work in a university, you don't have to only be inward looking, writing for people who are also researchers, or maybe are your students. That you can be an outward facing person, an outward facing researcher if you're based in a university. And I was like, this is it. This is what I want to do. Rather than the kind of daily deadline of journalism, I'd like to get a job in university, but the kind of books that I might write or the research I would do, while I want it to be serious research and I want it to make a contribution to knowledge, which is what kind of research is supposed to do, I want it to be accessible for a wider audience. I want to be looking outwards. The other thing that happened is I just got fed up with politics. I mean, I follow it. I think it's important to vote. But I just found at that particular historical moment in the early 1990s that I was just getting, we had a right-wing government in power back then. We still have a right-wing government now. I'm not right-wing. I consider myself to be definitely left of centre. It was very frustrating, and it seemed to me that no matter how much you would expose the failings of these governments, they would still get re-elected. And I just felt like I was more drawn to, and I felt I could make more of a contribution in the cultural realm. It wasn't just the logical thing. It was more instinctive, but I was passionate about culture. And I thought, well, maybe this is also a place of change. You don't always, the only way to introduce change into the world is not only through parliamentary politics. Power is all around us. and it exists in the party, and amongst other things, it's in popular culture, music, film, wherever we want to look. Everything carries meaning and is a way of power being organized and change being explored and enacted. And I just felt like, this. And my dad had, the other thing I haven't really said is that my dad, I'm Jewish. My dad had come out of Nazi Germany as a 15-year-old on Kindertransport, which was the trains that the Allies organized to bring young Jewish kids out of Nazi Germany, but just before the war started. And he'd arrived in the UK aged 15 years old.
Oh, wow.
And to my, I was always very proud of the fact that he went on to not only study English, take a degree in English literature, but become an English teacher.
How old would your father be now if he was alive?
Oh, right. I really should know this. And
sorry, because I'm going to tell you a tip.
Yeah. Hang on. So he was 63. He was 64 when he died in 1987. So we've got to add 13. We've got to add 34 years. So he would be kind of 98. Yeah. So.
Okay. Because also Alex Rosner is
I know. Yeah.
As well as
sorry, I interrupted you. Yeah, go on, tell me about Alex Rosner. Yeah.
Alex Rosner is also a I think if I remember correctly on the Schindler's List, he's he's in the film. He was also he was on the, I think he was he came out of Nazi Germany as well, in an incredible story. I think it's in Love Saves the Day. I mean, I interviewed Alex for Love Saves the Day. He told me his story. I think it was through, I haven't reread this book ever, and I wrote it a little while ago. I remember good bits of it for sure. But I think his father was music. It was a musical family, and it was through music that he was able to come out, to survive. I don't think he was on the Kindertransport, but he was able to survive the concentration camps, the extermination camps. And he wound up doing in the end. In the end, he became
absolutely incredible. Yeah,
incredible sound man in some of the best clubs in New York and some of the greatest places. But when you mentioned about your father, I had to mention Alex.
No, thank you. Yeah, no, that's really, really. I'm really happy you made that connection. Yeah. So my dad had, was absolutely loved literature. I was trying to find meaning in life because of, my parents dying, and it was a time of transition, and I wanted to spend more time thinking. So I thought, go to New York, be near this guy, Edward Said, who was a bit of a hero, study for a doctorate in English literature, but try and bring in I was going to do a bit of literature, a bit of film, a bit of music. I was going to do a chapter on rave culture because it had just been criminalized in the UK in 1994 by the John Major Conservative government.
Please search for part 2 of this podcast on the platform you're watching or listening to. And please do not forget to follow us.